Brothers and sisters, welcome to day 6 of our Advent series. We've been saying that only God knows the particular road that each person passes on the way to holiness, and that holiness is something unique. When you become who you are, St. Catherine of Siena says, you will set the world on fire. Her image for fire comes from the idea of her overall image for God as fire himself, that when we become who we are, we become so one with God that God's life burns in us. So we partake in God's nature in a unique way. So it's a real Dominican principle in our Dominican spirituality that grace perfects nature and elevates the particular gifts and skills that God has created you with, that grace perfects that. So as we grow in wholeness, you should become you. You should become the you that God created. And a big part of this is being faithful to the Holy Spirit, because the Holy Spirit knows particularly the path that you have to walk on. And this is what we've been saying, that this is why it's so important to be faithful to the Spirit, because God knows that path that we ourselves don't know at times. So, yes, it's good to be faithful to the general commandments of God and his teachings and stuff, but we said that, and it's important just to open up that a little bit more today, that God has particular things for us to do and particular virtues to develop, we could say, and just a particular path of holiness that he's called us to. So if he knows what that is, then it makes sense to try to learn how to be faithful in our hearts, to discern God's voice and to follow that. Father Jacques Philippe says that, it's important to know at any given moment which virtue we should give priority to. Not according to our own ideas, but according to what God actually wants of us, because that is what will be infinitely more effective. And it isn't always what we may think. It can happen that we make superhuman efforts to improve on one point, while God is asking us for something else. For example, we may be making a supreme effort to correct a character defect, while what God is asking us to do is to accept it with humility and gentleness towards ourselves. Sometimes that's very difficult. We may have this really intense image of something that we have to do for God, but in fact, it's maybe beyond our effort, and that God, in fact, as Father Jacques Philippe says, just wants us to be humble to accept that isn't for me. In fact, this is how Saint Therese discovered her own vocation as love in the heart of the church. She got this inspiration to go to the scriptures, and she read in St. Paul about the mystical body having different parts, and she said, well, I can't do all these big asceticisms and fasts like some of the other sisters and other people. She just wasn't able. She was sick quite often, but she said, I could just do love. I could love in little things. And this is through that inspiration she discovered her own vocation. Like God calls us to perfection, but often what our understanding of perfection needs a lot of purification over time. God's not a perfectionist, but he does call us to perfection. And sometimes our own perfectionism can be a block to our own journey to holiness, because it could be a real mask for a deep pride in us. And so often God, allows things sometimes to fall apart so that we could be humble and attached only to him. So let's go on and talk about, one of the basic fundamental principles in this path of being faithful to the Holy Spirit is to start to be faithful to God, the promptings of the Holy Spirit in very little things. There's a general spiritual fundamental principle to this whole thing, that when we're faithful to God in little things, he will give us bigger inspirations. So faithfulness, you could say, draws greater inspirations. Father Jacques Philippe, he quotes the gospel, well done, good and faithful servant. You have been made faithful over a little. I will set you over much. And so there's a spiritual law here, that we will obtain the graces to be faithful in the important things that at present we find impossible, by first of all beginning with being faithful to little things in our grasp. And this is how often people overcome addictions or other problems, or serious moral defects. It's just by trying to not do big things, but little things will add up and help us overcoming very quickly other bigger problems. So this is a a fundamental principle of capital importance, that faithfulness to these smaller inspirations will lead us to be more and more open, more and more tuned to listening to God, and then God will give us maybe great inspirations, if that is His will. So it's very important to respond to those little promptings of the Spirit. To, if you see people in your house that are in need, that you will love them, serve them. Might be friends. The Lord might be putting somebody on your heart to call and to give a word of love and encouragement to. It's to respond to these little acts of inspiration, or just in looking around, as I said, to the needs of people in your workplace, and you feel called to love them, but laziness might hold you back. But God might be prompting you, stirring you to act. So act. Try and be attentive to love, the demands of love, and then in those little things, then you'll be able to hear God's voice in greater ways for bigger things.